So far, we've talked about how constructs are complex, how we should focus on measuring attitudes, knowledge, behavior, and results in regard to human outcomes, the importance of having reliable and valid surveys, choosing a question type that aligns with the construct, writing questions that are easy to understand, assessing our sample, and the last thing we'll talk about is being thoughtful about measurement decisions. I'm going to focus in on three measurement decisions you want to be aware of. Considering whether you want to use orthogonal measurement, and I'll explain what I mean by that, being cautious about aggregating data, and being skeptical about using quantitative measures. Okay, so the first thing you want to think about is your construct orthogonal, binary or orthogonal? And I will explain what I mean by that. So orthogonal really, at its heart, it just means independent. It just means two things are independent of one another, but it's used in a very specific way. Say I want to measure whether you are an active person or not. I'll probably give you a Likert item that looks something like this. Rate yourself on a scale 1 to 5 from very inactive to very active. And if you're not very active, you'll say you're a 2. If you're super active, you'll say you're a 5, whatever it is. But another way to think about this question is to have you independently rate yourself on how active you are and how inactive you are. And I'll rate you on 1 to 5 from not inactive to very inactive. And then independently of that, you can rate yourself on 1 to 5 from not active to very active. Now, you might think that this is repetitive, that if you are a very active person, then by definition, you are not inactive. But that's not true. So I would consider myself very high on both of these things. I exercise 4 or 5 hours a week, so that's pretty active. But I spend the vast majority of my day sitting on my couch in my pajamas recording lectures like I'm doing right now. So most of my day, I'm very sedentary. And then a few times during the week, I'm very active. What researchers have found is that those things independently predict things like heart disease. That, yeah, going out and running 3 times a week is really good for your heart and in reducing the chance of heart disease. But independent of that, if you're just sitting around the rest of the day, that's bad for you. And it doesn't matter how much you run. If you're sitting around 8 hours a day, that's still going to have a negative impact on your health. So it actually makes sense to look at these things not as opposite ends of the same spectrum, but as two different constructs, activity and inactivity. You might say, okay, that's a pretty random example though. How would we see this in organizations? Well, there's actually been a lot of research showing that job satisfaction is like this, that job satisfaction and job dissatisfaction are not opposite ends of the spectrum, that people can be both very satisfied with their job and at the same time very dissatisfied with their job, and that job satisfaction comes from different sources than job dissatisfaction. So for example, we see that job satisfaction comes from things like your job being meaningful, learning new things at work, being challenged in your abilities. Those things contribute to job satisfaction. Job dissatisfaction is driven by things like whether you get paid adequately, whether you get along well with your supervisor, and whether your work atmosphere is pleasant. So if we measure these as two sides of the same coin, we're losing a lot of valuable information. So I would encourage you, when you're measuring something, to think about, should I measure this as a spectrum or should I measure this orthogonally? All right, so we consider orthogonal measurement. The next thing we want to do is be very careful about how we aggregate data. So by aggregate data, I mean just like put data together. Usually we do this like when we calculate an average. So earlier in the semester, we talked about different organizational designs, functional design, divisional design, matrix design. There are going to be times when I want to compare, say, departments within my company. I want to compare the accounting department to the marketing department on job satisfaction. Or I want to compare the North American division to the European division on organizational commitment. Or I want to compare different teams in the matrix in a matrix organization on some outcome, right? And so the way we usually do that is, that's my cat, by the way, he has a bell on his collar. The way we usually do that is we take the average, right? I'll take the average job satisfaction in accounting and compare it to the average job satisfaction in marketing, and I'll see which one has the higher average. Now, I'm not criticizing that. That's a useful thing to do, but we need to be very careful about how we aggregate data. Let me give you an example of why this is important. So say I want to compare students' ratings of my class when I was using the traditional classroom structure versus when I'm using a flipped classroom structure. So I calculate the average rating of students in the traditional classroom structure, and that's 3 out of 5. And then my flipped classroom, I calculated as well, also 3 out of 5. So just by looking at these averages, I go, okay, either way, students are both kind of fair to middling on my teaching, regardless of what type of classroom design I use. That would be the assumption I make looking at these averages. Now let's take a look at the underlying data. So for the traditional classroom, the data look like this. Where everyone's kind of in agreement. You have most people centered around that 3. You've got maybe a few people who really like it and give it a 5. Some people that really dislike it and give it a 1. But we see a lot of agreement between students on their ratings here. For the flipped classroom, it might look something like this, where there are some students that absolutely love it. It's like their favorite thing in the world. They give me straight 5s. This is just great. And then the other half of students absolutely hate it, and they give me straight 1s. So actually in this, there's no one who even rated me a 3, right? Even though the average is 3, everyone was either, yes, this is great, we're going to give you a 5, or, oh, I hate this, I'm going to give you a 1. So if I just look at the averages, it's really tempting to see these as the same. When I look at the underlying data, it's clear that these are not the same. And that actually taking the average of the flipped classroom doesn't even make sense given these data. We see this with supervisor ratings all the time, that we have supervisors that have like an in-group, like their little clique, who love them and they rate that supervisor really high. And then there are people on the out-group who don't get along with that supervisor and they rate them really low. So again, we see this, what we call a bimodal distribution, where we have a lot of people on the high end and a lot of people on the low end. In that case, it does not make sense to look at the average. If no one rated that supervisor as a 3, it doesn't make sense to say that that supervisor's average rating is a 3. It's not giving us useful information. So when you combine data across teams, across departments, across divisions, it's really important to look at the data first and make sure that the average is giving you a meaningful number. All right, so we've considered whether to use orthogonal measurement. We're cautious about aggregating our data. The last thing is just to be skeptical about using quantitative measures. Ask yourself if the construct, the thing you're really trying to measure, is actually quantifiable. In psychology, we have convinced ourselves that we can measure these deeply complex things with a number and that number is meaningful. So I can take something like happiness and reduce it down to a 5, right? Happiness is an incredibly complex emotion, and I don't know if calling it a 5 does justice to what we're really trying to understand. Same thing with job satisfaction, same thing with organizational commitment, same thing with task significance and the meaning that you get from your work. Can those things meaningfully be broken down into a single number? Sometimes it's better just to use your judgment than to try to quantify everything. Now, let me say that with a big caveat, which is that quantifying things is difficult, and I think we too often fall into the trap of using judgment. Oh, this is good or this is okay. They're a good worker. Using qualitative judgments like that, instead of really pushing ourselves to find objective ways to quantify the thing that we are interested in. So I think you should really, really try to quantify things. Now, that being said, some things at the end of the day just are not quantifiable, and when we pretend they are, when we pretend that we can boil their simplicity down to a single number, we're missing a lot of really important information. All right, so that is it. Today we talked about how constructs are complex, how we should measure attitudes, knowledge, behavior, and results when we're interested in human outcomes, how surveys need to be reliable and valid, that we should choose a question that aligns with our construct, that we should write questions that are easy to understand, that we should assess our sample and make sure it's representative of the population that we're interested in, and finally, that we should be thoughtful about things like orthogonality, aggregating data, and quantification in general.